In this session, we're going to be talking about the human problem. And what do we mean by the human problem? Essentially, it's that human beings are filled with angst, anxiety, disconnect, brokenness, that we constantly feel that there's something wrong, missing in our lives. And so religions present sources for why we feel this way, but then they also present solutions to try to fix that brokenness. And so one of the things that we're going to be talking about is like first off, it's like what is this human problem? And one of the clips I ask you to go watch the soliloquy or monologue from Hamlet. He is not having a good day. He is not having a good go. Where his father is murdered, or his father dies. His mom marries his uncle. His father's the king, and so now his uncle is the king, and he is really just not having a very good. He's filled with dread, angst, and what have you, and stress, and rightly so. But one of the things that we see, like with this human problem, is like that we always feel like there's something more to life, that there's something out there that we're searching for, that we're not content. And so one of the things we want to think about is like, okay, it's like, what is the source of all of this? And religions provide different responses to that. But we're in need of enlightenment, reconciliation, or salvation, or atonement. And so we can't just be like there's something off. We get depressed, we get sad. And so religions try to address this by saying, okay, there's a source for that. And then we also provide a solution to that issue. So what's at the root of the problem? So in this session, we'll be talking about like Stoicism, and we'll be talking about Christianity. Well, Marx has an approach through alienated social relationships, but we'll be talking about Confucianism and Theravada Buddhism as well. And so for each one of these, they present a source for the problem itself and then a solution to the problem. So in Stoicism and in ancient Greek philosophy, it's ignorance, really. And so knowledge would be the solution. And in Christianity, you have a sinful will, or pride is the issue. And so you need to turn back toward the divine. The brokenness is a turn away, or the fall, a turn away from the divine. And Theravada Buddhism, the issue is craving, and the solution there is like, well, just stop craving. But we'll talk a little bit more about that one as we go through it. So ways to solve this different problem. We're going to look through these 4 ways really quick and to talk about some examples. I think Buddhism is really, is going to be it's a little bit different in the sense that it's a different mode of thinking about the human being. If we look at Stoicism, talking about like its origins, again, this is sort of ancient Greek philosophy, and so one of the things we want to be thinking about is you have this is developed in response to these fatalistic attitudes of like, okay, there's nothing that you can do, you just accept your fate. But what Stoicism argues is that like actually the world is not chaotic. There's an ordered whole, and it's governed by divine reason. And so this physis, or nature, it shapes all these living things into their proper form. And so what we have to do in order to achieve symbiosis or symmetry is like we have to then live according with this nature. We have to fit our own aims with that of this divine reason. And so really the idea is like we don't create our own happiness, but what we do is we become happy when we accord ourselves or align ourselves with nature, with what is going on. And so if we don't, that's how we're going to find misery and happiness. So if I wish something else, if I wish it to be a different way, if I wish something to be different, if I wish a family member didn't die, then what I'm doing is I'm actually trying to work against reason. I'm trying to work against the natural order of things. And that's why I become unhappy. And so we can't change the nature. So we have to accept the divine reason and the order of all things. And so this, if you think about like a stoic person or a stoic attitude, it's like someone who's unfazed. They can't be, you can't get under their skin, because what they're doing is like they're aligning themselves with the way things are. So things that we can't control, do not try to control, but accept it as a good, as the order of the world. And so even death itself. Again, we have to accept this as the order of the world. A dog, a loved one, well, yourself, but I guess that wouldn't really matter. These things are not in our control, and so we're supposed to treat them with indifference or apathia, or apathy. But this is what leads to freedom and leads to happiness. So because if we constantly, and you see this in relationships with other people, we constantly try to control what happens. We constantly try to control other people, and that's what leads to our own unhappiness. And so we can't control what happens, but we can only control how we respond to what happens. We have to resign ourselves and align ourselves to what happens, because that is exactly what it is meant to be, because the world is ordered, it is not chaotic. So we control what is good and what is bad. Again, these are just adjectives that we slap onto things. It's like, oh, that's good, that's bad. But like there's a there's a children's book of, it's like there's this something really good happens, but oh no, that's bad. It's actually not a good thing. This person gets this little kid gets a bunch of balloons. It's like, oh, that's good. Oh, now these balloons are floating the kid away. Well, that's bad. So really it's like we're the ones that are assigning these good and bad evaluations on things, and we have to stop doing that. And liberation is actually the source of it's just a mental viewpoint. And we can't exchange the things. We can't change the things around us. What we can do is change the mental viewpoint that we have. Now, if you look at Christianity, it's a little bit different. And so Christianity, we have the human problem is not rooted in us like not accepting the order of things, but it's rooted in the paradoxical nature of the human. And so on the one hand, human beings are directed toward God, because human beings, according to Christianity, were created in the image and likeness of God, or this imago Dei. Humans are like God, but not God. And so at the same time, human beings are selfish things. And so, and what sets up this, we saw it in the cosmogonic myth with Christianity. It sets up this understanding of a fall. And even if it is not supposed to be taken as literally true, this creation account, it is true for Christians in the sense that it establishes that relationship between human beings and the divine. And it establishes this relationship that human beings are prideful and they turned away from God. And that's the source of disharmony. That's the source of the brokenness. It's a turning away from God. And so you can see with these, we talked about in Max Weber's, like this web of significance of all of these components of religion needing to prop one another up. And this is an incredibly good example of that. Sorry, I jumped ahead right here. Where are we? Okay. Okay, Christianity. Okay, human beings were given the gift of reason, and what that does is that helps us point us back toward God. And being able to think through these things. So, and there's a little bit goes into a little bit more detail in the text about what's the difference between the Catholic approach and the Protestant approach with regard to that, but in the imago Dei, or the in the image of God. But what we're here is we're capable of self-transcendence and self-determination, and so reason gives us this notion of self-determination. We're able to think, and free will is self-determination, but we're also self-determination. We're able to think beyond ourselves, but thinking beyond ourselves, we use this in a destructive way, and we assert ourselves and put our own selves at the center of things, our own ego at the center of things. And this is that turn away from God. Is when you live your life for yourself. For Christians, that is the turn away from God. That's the road to perdition. That's the road to unhappiness. And it's breaking that covenant with God. So as when you're doing things for yourself instead of for God or in alignment with God. And St. Augustine talks about like the pride. Pride is the beginning of all sin. And again, with the fall in the creation account, you see this quote unquote original sin, and that becomes part of the human condition for Christians, for Roman Catholics and Protestants alike, is that sin is embedded into the human condition, that we cannot yank that out. And the only way that we can fix this disordered relationship with God is through God's grace, is what Christians argue. So it's like the only thing that you can do, it's like we can't do anything. We can't save ourselves. But God presents this gift freely. We'll talk more about it when we talk about soteriology, and we'll talk about Martin Luther's approach to this. But the idea is that the only thing that can fix this broken relationship between human beings and the divine is God's grace. It has to be fixed on the divine side, not on our side, because that if we can fix it on our side, it implies that we have power over God, and that's and Christians are kind of opposed to that. So what happens is Christ is in part of this process. So the figure of Jesus Christ in Christianity is this Savior who is fully God and fully human. And by Christ sacrificing himself for all of humanity, what he does is he rights that relationship between God and humanity. So he fixes that broken sense of humanity that happened in the fall or happened with original sin. And so that's why you have in the Christian prayers that Christians believe that that Jesus descended into hell and rose on the third day, and he established himself as a victor over death, and that rewrited that relationship, that broken relationship between in the creation account between Adam and Eve and God at the outset in that creation myth. But that doesn't take away this notion of being a sinful nature. It just opened the pathway for that reconciliation. So if we move to Theravada Buddhism, this is where we want to think a little bit differently about human beings. Okay, and so take a step back, and there's a saying with Heraclitus, who is an ancient Greek philosopher, and we all have excerpts of his writings. The ancient Greek philosopher, and he said, "You can never step in the same river twice." So think about what that means. You can't step in the same river twice. It's because the river is always in flux. It's always changing. And we as people are not really people. We're just a temporary amalgamation of characteristics at this moment in time. We're in a constant state of becoming. So we are in a constant state of flux. And so what that means then is that I am not really an I. I am not really a self. So even the self in Theravada Buddhism and in most strands of Buddhism, there is no self. Okay? And it's the teaching of the not self. And so what makes us what makes me I'm not an individual ego. I'm not an individual I separated from another person. Okay, so what makes up the quote unquote I is not actual parts of the individual, or what makes up the I is not actually parts of the individual, but I'm in phases in a series of changes. So there's no self, there's no soul to speak of, there's no I to speak of, except for convention's sake. Okay? And so we have this essentially, it's like, well, we have this agreement. It's like, okay, Chris is standing over here, Colin, my son, is standing over there. Okay, so for convention, but really, Colin and Chris are both in a state of becoming and a state of falling away. And so there is no existential I. Okay, so what we call the enduring self, the enduring soul, or the ego is in reality only an aggregate of phenomenal processes. And so if you take all the characteristics that constitute me, I'm 6 feet tall, I have blonde hair, I don't know what else. I have 2 arms. It's like you take all of these different characteristics of me. Is like in that's what I am. I'm just this amalgamation of characteristics for a moment in time. So if you just think about a desk. Okay? A desk wasn't always a desk. A desk came into being by being an element in the earth, and say like iron and wood, brought together. People forged it, brought together, hammer these things together, and for a momentary time period, and if think of the great expanse of time, for a momentary period, we call it a desk, and we call it this desk and that desk and this desk and that desk. But it's in its essence, in its reality, it is only a desk in it for a temporary moment, because these things have come together. In a million years from now, it's not going to be a desk anymore. it's going to go back to what it was, to its elemental nature. So there is no, think of it as the same thing for me. It's like my friend Steve, who's a Buddhist monk, he would talk about like think of the self as like the very tip of a wave that that it's like that you are an eye, the very, very tip of a wave, and you're coming to be out of the ocean, and you're on that tip for just a momentary time, and then what you call you goes back into and becomes one with the ocean again. Okay, so what you have to do is to overcome this notion of self. As in Theravada Buddhism, it teaches this doctrine of not self, because what happens is belief in the self will lead invariably to suffering. And this is the root of all unhappiness and sorrow. And so what we have to do is we have to understand these four noble truths for Buddhism. So the first noble truth is the reality of dukkha, or the reality of suffering. And suffering is more than pain. It's the conflict between our desires and reality. And so well, let's go right into the next one. The cause of this suffering. So we have the reality of suffering is there. The cause of suffering is craving. And this is really the most essential of noble truths, because this really sets up the stage for Buddhism and its whole sort of structural belief system, or philosophy. And so the cause of suffering is craving. We desire something to remain what it is. When it changes, we suffer. We desire someone to continue to love us. We desire someone to stay alive. We desire a car to stay new, even though it might get scratched. Or we desire a phone, to not break. We desire things to remain what they are when we experience them, and when things change, we suffer, because we don't have this third noble truth, or the fourth noble truth. Okay, is we don't understand this. The liberation from craving, or the liberation from suffering, is through cessation of craving. If we don't crave, we don't suffer. And nirvana is the extinction of thirst. Now, that doesn't mean people say, it's like, well, that's really cold-hearted. Does that mean, like, in Buddhism you can't love? It's like, no, that's not the case at all. You can still love, okay, but you have to understand at the same time that this is a temporary moment in passing. That this love, that it is going to pass on, and it's going to come into being and go out of being. So yeah, so really it's this liberation from dukkha through cessation of craving. And really you do this by living by the way, or by the Eightfold Path. And there's 8 things, and we'll talk about that with soteriology. And the Eightfold Path, you have like the right action, right understanding. You have all of these things that you have to do to follow the Eightfold Path. But really the crux of Buddhism is trying to understand ourselves as not an individual I, but just a collection of characteristics at a momentary time. And so if we can understand that, and we can embrace that and fully understand that, then we can start to eliminate our suffering. Confucianism, it's a little bit different in the sense that it's not necessarily a religious system, and it's more of a philosophical system, more a behavioral system. And so for this, the solution to strife was to return to this golden age of social rites and rituals of an earlier era, because these rites had won the mandate of heaven, because they're associated with an era of peace. Okay, so these rites and rituals, and there's five relationships that are shown in the text, but and these are relationships between kings and rulers, and sons and fathers, and what's called filial piety, which is taking care of your elders in a particular family. So society perseveres through instilling correct patterns of behavior. And this is a focus caused by a focus on personal desire and undoing the rules of social propriety. How do we solve this? How do we solve this unhappiness? It is just through education. It is to understand how you're supposed to act and how you're supposed to be in certain situations, and that will bring happiness. We don't understand how we are supposed to relate to one another. Okay, and so that's the source of unhappiness. The way we learn those is through education. Okay, and it involves this imitation of exemplary models. So ritually, it's the foundation of education, And it humanizes our relationships. And the final definition is like this ritual action that shapes our behavior and character. Um, it emphasizes filial piety or deference and respect for one elders. But really, it establishes like these proper ways to act in relationship to one another. Maybe we need this in our society right now. Okay, so a great society is not achieved by law or physical power, but by examples of moral virtue and character and how we relate to one another. And there's certain rules, there's certain rituals that you need to embrace in order to relate to one another. So that's all. That's all we have for these. The modes and approaches of the human problem, and trying to explain why we might be unhappy, and potential solutions for it. So hopefully maybe you found one of these that can make you happy. But we'll talk more about this over the next week, and yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing your responses. And for this week, I think there's just a quiz. But looking for your responses as we move through the week. All the best.